Welcome back into the Comcast SportsNet studios. By the way, I forgot to say hello to everybody watching us online on WashingtonPost.com. So, hello. Don't forget about the emails, Al Koken and Mike Wise. And now, celebrating 75 years of Redskins history, it's nice to be able to put it all into one book. Mike Richman has written the Redskins Encyclopedia, which should be hitting bookstores in September. And Mike, first of all, that must have been just an overwhelming project when you first started to compile 75 years of history into one volume.
Well, it's been a 7.5-year project. I started on it in January of 2000. And there's been a lot of research, a lot of newspaper articles, and old videos. The Redskins were very cooperative with me. Players were very easy with interviews for the most part. I had a few who were not that cooperative, so magazine articles were very important too.
Well, you know, I'm going to imagine, since it's an encyclopedia by name, you would be able to go back and get all the stats from every game and every year and all that stuff. But what I'm more interested in is, what kind of other stories did you unearth when going through this type of research? You know, sidebar stories that maybe people haven't heard of before. Can you give me an example of anything? Well,
Steve Sabol, the executive director for NFL Films, told me what I think is one of the most interesting in the book, and that is in the mid-'60s, when he was still working with his father at NFL Films, they were instructed by George Halas, the owner of the Bears, that Halas said he did not like the video footage. He didn't like the Bears fans. He didn't like the way they looked. So Sabol incorporated Redskins footage into the Bears videos. And
what was the difference between the Bears fans and the Redskins at that point?
Sabol told me that at the time the Bears fans looked like, quote, thugs. They had the boxcar haircuts. They had the leather jackets, guns. He told me
basically Urlacher's family.
Wow.
Basically.
They just
it's Mike Wise, ladies and gentlemen.
They didn't look like the nicest people. Anyway, so the Redskins fans, from what Sabol said, looked like they were headed to church that morning. I mean, they had the camel coats and the just well-behaved people. So he incorporated that footage into the Bears videos, and he told me that until the day he died, Halas never knew about it.
He obviously never looked down from his perch above Soldier Field.
Mike, I'm curious, again, thinking like an encyclopedia, if I go look up Joe Gibbs, do I see Joe Gibbs 1 and Joe Gibbs 2, or is it just Joe Gibbs?
Well, the first explanation of Joe Gibbs that I did was during the 80s and early 90s. There's a lot of him during that era, obviously, I mean, the glory years. And then one can read about Joe Gibbs today, and for the past 3 seasons. But I also wrote a profile of him in which I included the early years and what he's done for the past few seasons. I mean, I had to write. I couldn't escape the fact that, you know, it's been mostly disappointing for the past 3 years. I had to.
And was there anybody like Sonny or Billy Kilmer or somebody that you came across where you just soaked it up like you were a little kid again, listening to a game or a player from way back when, Riggo, whoever, describing a play? Or who was your favorite interview, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Vince Permuto, a guard in the 60s, Redskins guard in the 60s, was great. I loved the stories that he told about how he grew up in New York City and how it was, you know, guys were, you know, in battles every day for survival. And by the time he was drafted by the Redskins, he didn't know that there was a team called the Washington Redskins. He thought it was in Washington State. So he was great. Dyron Talbert was great. Redskins tackle from the 70s, defensive tackle. I mean, I loved how he spoke about the George Allen era. A lot of people elaborated on Allen and how he was so neurotic in terms of his approach to the game and coaching. Let's see, Dexter Manley. I really got him to go deep into his story about how he, quote, prostituted himself in the drug world and how he, you know, he could have been in the Hall of Fame if he had just focused on football. I mean, he was that good. He has the Redskins record for sacks, and he was snorting cocaine.
And of course, all the players and the coaches, it's all very interesting, but there's something very tangible about the rivalries as well. We actually have an emailer, James, who emailed in. He wants to know, and he's asking you specifically, when did the Cowboys rivalry begin with the Redskins?
I would say the Cowboys rivalry began when George Preston Marshall was trying to block the Cowboys from coming into the league. Marshall was the Redskins owner at the time. The Cowboys were being considered in the late 1950s. Marshall didn't want them in the league.
Why not?
Because he felt at the time that, the Redskins controlled that southern territory. They were known as the team of the South. And they even played exhibition games as far west as Texas. So Marshall did not want the Cowboys in the league for that reason, thinking that they would steal Redskins fans. But the Cowboys were allowed to come into the league, and there was an incident that took place in a 1961 game at then DC Stadium where a bunch of pranksters wanted to throw live chickens onto the field at halftime to spite Marshall. They just didn't like him because he was trying
to... chicken from the Cowboys.
Right. Yeah. But, Michael, isn't it also true about when we talk about George Preston Marshall, one of the reasons why there seems to be an unusual amount of Cowboy fans within Washington is a lot of African-American fans hated George Preston Marshall because of how he kept African-Americans off the team and have responded because of that. And I'm just very curious. He seems to be a very kind of lightning rod for a lot of negativity when it comes to the Washington Redskins.
Well, that is true that he did not want to integrate the team. After World War II, more black players started coming into the NFL. But he didn't want to sign one. The Redskins controlled the South, and he didn't want to alienate his southern base, I guess playing on stereotypes. But he was forced to. When the Redskins moved into DC Stadium, now RFK, in 1961, the federal government started getting on Marshall's back, saying, you need to integrate the team, or you're going to lose your lease to play at DC Stadium. I believe at the time, DC Stadium was on federal property. So the Department of the Interior said that you need to sign a black player. And what a lot of people don't understand is that Bobby Mitchell was the first Redskins superstar, but there were 3 other black players that played for the Redskins that season.
You know, getting back to the RFK issue, we got a couple emailers in that want to know what your thoughts are. In reference to the Cowboys and the stadium issue, now that Jerry Jones is building this colossus in Arlington that's going to open in 2009, do you think Dan Snyder is going to keep this team at FedEx Field where it is, or maybe try to move it back into the district and maybe build something that's even bigger?
Well, that has certainly been rumored, and I mean, unless you're in the front office, I don't know how you could say at this point, but I think it would be a worthy venture, and I think it might attract the Super Bowl to Washington, D.C. You could build a dome stadium.
Mike, I think you're holding out on us. You're wearing a Redskins tie. You have a Redskins watch on. For all we know, you have Redskins underoos. What you know the insider. You're on Snyder's payroll, aren't you? You can admit it.
I actually do freelance work for the Redskins. So.
All right, there it is, right there. I got it.
If I were a better host, I would have stepped in and stopped it earlier. I apologize.
That's all right.
How much little detail, like the fun little details, because, you know, in working with guys like Doc Walker over the years, I've heard some, you know, great, interesting stories that I'm sure probably couldn't be in your book because it's actually going to be a book that you want everybody to read. But things like the 5 o'clock club and great little anecdotes about groups like that. Are there some details and some good kind of behind-the-scenes things that maybe a lot of people don't really know about some of the great famous Redskin teams and how they were made up?
Well, I do touch on the 5 o'clock club. Actually, Dyron Talbert told me that he founded the club. I guess there was a 5 o'clock club in the 70s, and I think there was one in the 80s, too.
So that predates Jacoby and all those guys.
The Riggins and Jacoby, I think those guys founded their own 5 o'clock club in the 80s. But,
and up the ante probably a little bit.
But, like, for instance, when... You know, shortly after Gibbs came, I write about how well, everybody knows the story about how he went to Kansas and was trying to influence Riggins to come back. And I interviewed Gibbs on that, and, you know, got him to go pretty deep into it. And then there are other stories through the glory years that I touch on. I think there's a very interesting story that a guy named Steve Gilmartin told me. He was the Redskins play-by-play voice in the 60s and early 70s. He said that a Redskins middle linebacker by the name of Chuck Drzenovich, he was a really good player in the 50s. He once had a feud with a Green Bay Packers player in an exhibition game, and Drzenovich wanted to fight him after the game. But when Drzenovich found him in a bar, he saw this guy, I think his name was Ed Neal. He was cracking beer bottles on his arm. And Drzenovich, who was a boxing champ in college, said he backed off. He said, "Forget it. I don't want to fight this guy."
You know, for all the old stories, there's so many stories that we already know because they've become so much, you know, interwoven into the fabric of culture here in D.C. I'm sure the parts of the book about the glory year teams, the Super Bowl teams, Theismann's got to take up a big part of this book. I imagine Riggins has to take up a big part of the Art Monks of the world. How deep do you get into those guys? Did you uncover anything about Riggins that we don't know already? Or Theismann, for that matter?
Theismann, he was great. Agreed to an interview every time I called. He told me the story about how in the '81 season again, he was on the outs with Gibbs. And, you know, Theismann was thinking that he was going to be traded, he was going to be benched. The Redskins started the year 0-5. And Theismann thought, you know, this is it. You know, I'm not getting along with Gibbs. Things aren't working. So Theismann told me how he went to Gibbs' house. They talked it over. And as, you know, history tells it, you know, the Redskins recovered and the following season went on to the Super Bowl. There are other stories from the glory years. The Hogs. You know, I explained how the Hogs came to be, and also getting back to Riggins again, a very interesting story. After the '81 season, Joe Washington was still the Redskins' #1 back. They had split the duties during the '81 season because when Gibbs went more to a rushing type offense or more of a balanced offense, they still split the duties. But in the '82 exhibition season, Joe Washington was injured. And that's when Riggins was tapped as the #1 back. So that's sort of how he became, you know, he eventually became a star that year. If Joe Washington hadn't been injured, the Redskins may never have gone on to the Super Bowl that year, and Riggins wouldn't have become famous, maybe.
It's unbelievable, those little forks in the road that you don't know who's going to take. How do you treat this legacy of the Redskins? I mean, you have Clinton Portis, who had a great season and then an injured season, and then Joe Gibbs, who miraculously got the team back to the playoffs and then went 5-11. Do you have to be somewhat on balance, or how do you put these guys in context in the last 5-10 years?
Well, it's a totally different era. I mean, you're talking, this is the era of free agency. I mean, there's more freedom for them to move around. Then again, I mean, I think that there's a lot of promise for the Redskins this season. I think, you know, Jason Campbell has a lot of potential, and I think if they can just maintain the cohesiveness that the Redskins had during the first Gibbs era, I think they'll be in good shape. And I think this offseason that it was relatively quiet, I think that was a very good sign.
How much of this, the Redskins Encyclopedia, and that's what we're talking about. We were here with Michael Richman, who's put together the Redskins Encyclopedia, which is going to be coming out in September with Al Koken and Mike Wise. And how much of this is an academic pursuit of yours, and how much of it is a passion project?
I would say it's about 50-50. I mean, I'm a native Washingtonian. And I really became a hardcore Redskins fan when George Allen came to D.C. in 1971. One thing led to another. The Redskins had 5 playoff appearances during the Allen era. Then we had the Gibbs glory years. So I'm very passionate about the Redskins. At the same time, I'm a journalist. I've done a lot of sports writing in my career. So I sort of packaged the whole thing together.
All right. And
my writing skills, and as well as my interest in the Redskins.